Welcome to Business Studies Part 3. This lesson we're going to look at the different classifications of businesses in Australia. One of the main ways we classify businesses is in their industry sector. Primary industry basically refers to those businesses who are operating in the production involving natural resources. This includes farming, fishing, mining and forestry. All of those businesses basically produce a natural resource or mine a natural resource and sell it on to another company. There is actually a Minister of Primary Industries in Australia, controlled by the federal government, because the vast majority of Australia's exports come from the primary industry. Secondary industry refers to basically manufacturing. Manufacturers who are turning primary industry produce into finished goods. These include heavy industry like car manufacturers, which will from 2017 will no longer exist in Australia, through to food production manufacturers or anyone manufacturing anything from primary produce. And other examples of this include aluminium smelters and ironworks that are producing steel and aluminium, large heavy industry, all the way down to people who are making loaves of bread. Tertiary industry, and by far the largest industry group, is involved in providing a service. This ranges from healthcare and education through to lawyers and bankers, also down to just basic retail, so retail services. Approximately 80% of people employed in Australia are in the services industry. It's the fastest growing industry sector in the world, and particularly in Australia. In fact, it's so large that it's now divided up into two subsectors, known as the quaternary and quinary industries. They are both service industries, but have a different sector of the services sector that they play about in. The quaternary industry involves in services involving the transfer and processing of information. This includes telecommunications, financial services, and education, all related to information. Whereas the quinary industry involves in services that have traditionally, and by traditionally back to the 19th century, traditionally been performed in the home. Craft-based activities, things like childcare, food preparation and service, the restaurant industry, and some tourism-related activities involved in the quinary industry. A second way to classify businesses is in their legal structure. We looked at in the first lesson at the differences between sole traders and partnerships and private companies. Basically, there are two major classifications of legal structure. Sole traders and partnerships are unincorporated. They are not separate legal entities in their own right. For example, if you sue a sole trader, you are suing the person, or if you sue a partnership, you are suing the partners within the company, and they have liability for their debts. Whereas a private company or a public company are considered incorporated, which means they've been made into a corporation. That corporation exists as a legal entity in its own right. When you sue a company, you are suing the company itself, not the owners of it, and the company is liable for its own debts. If it has no assets, then basically you don't have much chance of recouping any of the debts that you are owed. You can't go after the directors or the owners of a company for their own personal assets because the company itself has limited liability. The process of incorporation typically means when you are turning your business into that you own as a sole trader or a partnership and turning it into a legal entity. So down at the bottom of this graphic, you'll see that sole trader and partnerships are the same legal entity as the owners. They're indivisible from their owners. If the owner passes away, then the business passes away as well. Whereas private companies exist as a separate legal entity. If the owners of a private company pass away, then the business still continues to exist, and they will continue to exist until someone actively winds up the business, applies to ASIC to wind up the business. Public companies are larger versions of the private company that are owned by shareholders. So private companies can have up to 50 owners. Public companies are unlimited in the number of individual shareholders that they can have. They are listed on the stock exchange, and shares in the company are traded freely. Private companies quite easily become a public company by floating themselves on the share exchange. They give up a portion of their company and sell it on the stock exchange. Investors then buy that and trade those shares willingly. In return for every year, if the private company makes a profit, they distribute that portion of the profit related to the number of shares out there to the shareholders. So if you own 10% in the company as a shareholder, you're entitled to basically 10% of their profits each year as a dividend. Um, Public companies can become private companies by buying their own shares back. So they can either do a capital raising off market, which basically means they go to a venture capitalist and get the money and then buy their own shares back, so they're wholly privately owned. They no longer have to report their earnings to the share market, and you can no longer buy and sell shares in that company because they've been taken off the exchange. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. More commonly, you'll see private companies become public companies by listing on a stock exchange. Let's go briefly through the advantages and disadvantages of the various ownership structures. The advantages of being a sole trader: it's the lowest cost of entry. It only costs you $150 at the Department of Fair Trading to go and register your business name and receive an Australian business number. It's the simplest form of company. The owner has complete control over it. It's less costly to operate. You're obviously not going to have any partner disputes because you don't have any partners, and the owner has the right to keep all the profits. There's less government regulation on sole traders, but you are taxed on the income. So you are considered, any income related to the sole trader is considered personal income. So you pay your personal income tax rate. The disadvantage is you have unlimited liability for your business debts. So if things go bad, you stand to lose everything. The business ends when the owner dies because the business is not considered separate legally from the owner. It is difficult to operate as section. So basically, if you aren't working, you aren't earning. You need to carry all losses. So basically, if the company goes losses, you need to find funding to carry on the business. You also, as well as performing the business, you have the burden of managing the business. So a sole trader not only does the operations required to earn the money, so if they're a plumber, they do the plumbing, but they also need to manage the business on top of that. They need to perform a wide variety of tasks, so not only doing the business, but running the business, but advertising the business, representing the business in public. It's also difficult to raise finance for expansion. If you wanted to expand your business, you typically have to incorporate and go to either a bank or venture capitalist, or even if larger, raise funds on the share market. It's very difficult to do that. As a sole trader, you certainly can't sell shares in a sole tradership on the share market. Partnership, on the other hand, similar advantages to a sole trader in that there's low startup costs. It's less costly to operate than a company. It still costs the same just to set up the company, $150 at the Department of Fair Trading. You can share responsibility and workload. So, for example, one of you could be in charge of running the operations and one could be in charge of selling the services or whatever you're doing in your business. You pool funds and talent. So basically, partners typically have different strengths and they work to those strengths. Again, there's minimal government regulation. And again, there's no taxes on the business profits, only on the personal income. And on the death of one partner, the business can keep going as long as the other partner or other partners are still alive. However, the disadvantage is, again, there's personal unlimited liability and unlimited liability for all debts, not just your own, but your partner's as well. So if your partner does the dirty on you in the business, you're still liable for their debts. There's often a possibility of disputes between partners. Things that start out with the best intentions can often go wrong. It can also be difficult to find a suitable partner. And there's divided loyalty and authority. If the partnership employs people, who do they report to if partners are equal? Companies, on the other hand, the advantage are it's easier to attract public finance, so you can float a company on the share market. Easier to go to a bank or a venture capitalist to receive funding. You have limited liability because the company itself is a separate legal entity from the owners. You can transfer ownership much more easily than you can as a partnership or as a sole trader. It enjoys a long life, so basically the company keeps going even if the owners are dead. You tend to have an experienced management, so the larger the company, they tend to have boards of directors that oversee the future direction of the company. These tend to be experienced business people with experience running similar sort of companies. You spread the risk not just amongst yourself, but also among the other owners of the company, or if you're a publicly listed company, amongst the shareholders. So you're not actually at risk only yourself. The company tax rate also tends to be lower than the personal income tax rate. At present, the company tax rate in Australia is 30% on profits, whereas the upper marginal tax rate on personal income is 49.5%. You have much more growth potential as a company. As I said, much easier to attract funding, but also you can grow much easier. Also, recent legislation allows a company to have only one shareholder and one director. So even though you are a you set up a company, you can still be the sole owner and sole director of the company. The disadvantages, it costs a lot more to form. You've got to go to the Australian Securities and Investment Commission and set up the company. You have to pay about $3,500 to do that. You get taxed on company profits and on your personal earnings. So it can be a bit of a mess taxation-wise. So typically, most companies have experienced and capable accountants to handle that part of them for them. You are exposed to personal liability for business debts if you knew at the time you were trading that the business was in trouble and unable to pay its loans. It is illegal to continue trading when the business is no longer considered viable. You must also publish a yearly annual report of audited accounts, so you have to pay a professional to come in and check your accounts each year. You don't have to do that if you're a sole trader or a partnership. You have public disclosure obligations. You must report certain information each year to the Australian Securities and Investment Commission or to the stock exchange if you're listed on the stock exchange. Also, you run the risk of becoming too large and too difficult to manage and resulting in inefficiencies in the company, in running the company itself. But we'll look at that later on in the course. Another way to look at distinguishing companies is a popular model for many businesses, particularly in Australia, the franchising model. And this is where typically a global company or a large multinational company will sell the rights to run its business model to individual owners. A classic example of this is McDonald's. McDonald's Corporation runs out of America. The people who own the stores are all individual business owners, and they buy the franchise rights to run a local store of McDonald's. The people who buy the rights are known as the franchisee. They buy the right to use the business name and distribute its goods and services. So McDonald's, they buy the right to call themselves McDonald's and sell Big Macs and other hamburgers and other associated products. The franchisor, or the person who owns the company, the parent company, grants the rights and provides a business structure to the franchisee. So again, using the case of McDonald's, they provided guidance and advice on how that business will run. And they also typically provide the marketing, as in they do the advertising on behalf of McDonald's. Each store owner locally may do their own marketing if they're running particular specials, things like that. Franchisee also provides the startup money, so the capital required to buy the store if it's buy the restaurant if it's a fast food restaurant. They provide the labour and they operate the business on behalf of the franchisor. They pay typically either annual fees or a percentage of the product sold back to the franchisor. The advantage of this model is basically you've got a business that's already set up and running elsewhere. You don't need to establish that business because people already know. For example, McDonald's, again being the classic case, people know what McDonald's is like, know what they're going to get. You don't actually have to establish goodwill in the local market. People will come and buy it already because they understand what the business model is about. For the franchisor, basically a fast and selective product distribution because you've got people who are buying all their outlets for you. You don't have to pay costs for construction. You don't have to pay operating costs of the outlets. And basically you have a fair bit of control over what people are selling and buying. You also tend to have franchisees who are motivated to be part of your business. They tend to work very hard rather than just straight employees. The advantage for the franchisee is it's an opportunity to start in a big business with limited finances. You pretty much guaranteed a customer base, so people who buy from one McDonald's store will happily buy from another, wherever you are. You don't, again, have to establish that business and business name. It's already established in the market for you. You have management backup from the franchisor, who can tell you how to run the business and provide advice, and you typically have proven methods of business if it's an established company. Disadvantages for the franchisor, you sometimes run into problems if you've selected an unsuitable franchisee. And it's very hard to back out of those agreements. That tends to cost very expensive legal fees to do that. You sometimes have a disagreement over the terms and conditions of the contract. The disadvantage for the franchisee is that the franchisor retains great control of their product and their market. You have limited scope to change things to suit your own individual business or your own individual market. There are sometimes disagreements over the conditions and terms of the contract. And also, if you are too successful in your business, the franchisor may decide to open up another store to compete with you. And you have very limited control over how they can do that. Right, for the rest of this lesson, basically what you need to do is complete the revision exercise, 2.4 of your textbook, complete questions 1 to 17.